Well, what a delight to be with you this afternoon, men, to discuss an issue that is both profoundly important and quite complex: medical ethics at the beginning and end of life. And my background in medicine and theology gives me some handle on discussing these issues. I've been out of medicine now 25 years. And there's been a whole rake of significant technological advances in medicine since I left the practice of medicine. And a lot of those anyway were beyond my area of specialty. So I'm certainly not a subject matter expert in these areas. But I do understand the lingo, and hopefully will begin to help you get your feet under you as you consider some of these things as pastors and theologians. Also, as Richard and I were talking about this talk, I'd actually been planning a different talk. I'd misunderstood his intention for this day, and so that became clear to me at the end of last week when I was out of town. So this was all put together this morning, and I'm going to be tied to my notes a lot more than normal, so I'm grateful for your patience as we delve through this. Let's begin with our theological foundation, shall we? Okay, life begins with God. He is, after all, the living God, the creator of the ends of the earth. His mind designed life, his heart cherishes it, and his will and his law demands that it be protected by human beings. And so if all of life begins with God, then all of life must be about God. You remember in John chapter 1, we're told, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. He is the beginning of everything that ever had a beginning, right? In him was life. In Christ was life, and the life was the light of men. What John is saying there is that behind all life, there is one who was originally alive. And the very fact that there is life on earth is a light bulb pointing us, a spotlight pointing us back to God. The very fact that we're alive, even atheists, the very fact that they're alive and they're surrounded by life gives them incontrovertible evidence, which they know that there was a God who created all life. And apart from that, where would life come from? That's a massive challenge for science, right? Have you ever seen non-life beget life? No, and neither has a scientist, right? It always takes life to produce life. And this challenge of where did life come from has only increased as our scientific knowledge has grown. Remember, back in the days of Darwin didn't have an electron microscope. He didn't understand the complicated cellular architecture that lies at the heart of the cells in our body. To his mind, the cell, which is like a brick in a wall, that was the building block of our life. Think about a cell for a second. A cell weighs 1/10 of 1/1000th of a gram. To put that in perspective, a single drop of water weighs about 500ths of a gram. It would therefore take 500 million cells to equal the weight of just one drop of water. Right? And so Darwin sees them as building blocks. Scientists in his day, Theodore Schwann and Matthias Schleiden, back in the 1830s and 40s, posited a theory that cells were the basic unit of life. But their complicated interworkings were unknown to them, right? Listen to this. This is from Michael Denton, his book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. He says this: although the tiniest bacterial cells are incredibly small, weighing less than 1/10 of 1/1000th of a gram, each is in effect a veritable micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery, made up altogether of 100,000 million atoms, far more complicated than any machine built by man, and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world. He goes on, to grasp the reality of life as it has been revealed by molecular biology, we must magnify a cell 1,000 million times until it's 20 kilometers in diameter and resembles a giant airship large enough to cover a great city like London or New York. What we would then see would be an object of unparalleled complexity and adaptive design. We would see endless, highly organized corridors and conduits branching in every direction. The nucleus itself would be a vast spherical chamber, more than a kilometer in diameter, resembling a geodesic dome, inside of which we would see all neatly stacked together in ordered arrays the miles of coiled chains of the deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. That is the computer program driving the whole shebang, essentially. What we would be witnessing would be an object resembling an immense automated factory, a factory larger than a city and carrying out almost as many unique functions as all the manufacturing activities of man on Earth. Now today, scientists would have us believe that that cell and all of the life that comes from cells happened by accident. A meaningless, purposeless, mindless explosion produced everything from the goo through the zoo to you, as has been said. But the Bible, of course, offers a different narrative. Cells are the specific, deliberate, intelligent products of the genius of Almighty God. He made them on purpose and He made them for His glory. Now, of all of the life forms littering the planet, human beings have a unique glory and deserve unique reverence. We alone, after all, are imago Dei. We are the image bearers of God. And you see this uniqueness spread abroad in the first chapter of the Bible. If you turn to Genesis 1 a second, we haven't got time to really do much, certainly no detailed exegesis of the passage. Let me highlight a few points. The uniqueness of man, right? First of all, the three baras in Hebrew in Genesis 1. So bara is the Hebrew word for create, right? Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? It occurs 3 times in Genesis 1. And the word means a new beginning, the creation of something of unparalleled significance and without precedent. And it's really only ever used in the Bible of God. There may be 1 or 2 exceptions to that, but in this sense, it's only ever used of God. God is the subject of bara, and it occurs 3 times in Genesis 1. That kind of chops the chapter up into 3 sections. First of all, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God barad. God created the heavens and the earth. That's the creation of everything out of nothing, unprecedented. The next time it occurs is down in verse 21. The creation of living things that move, with brains, bodies that run and walk and swim and so forth. So God barad, God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, Genesis 1:21. So you're going from plant life to animal life, unprecedented, new beginning, bara. And then in verse 27, you have the creation of human beings. So God barad man in His own image, in the image of God, He created him, male and female, He created them. And that's important because we're told today by scientists that human beings are just another animal. Well, Moses is telling you in the first chapter of the Bible that is precisely what you are not. You are not just another animal. You're separate from the animals. You belong in a unique category of living beings called imago Dei. A second distinction of man, or a distinguishing detail about man in Genesis 1, is that man alone hears the word of God spoken to him. Right? If you compare the blessing God spoke about the animals with the blessing God spoke to Adam and Eve, God blesses the animals in verse 22, and God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters and the seas and so forth. But in verse 28, the Hebrew added an additional word. And God blessed them, and God said to them. He spoke the blessing about the animals, but He speaks the blessing to Adam and Eve. They're able to understand it, to hear it, to comprehend it its meaning and its significance. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. That's one of the blessings of learning Hebrew in seminary. It slows you down, right? We read English too fast and we miss things. But Hebrew, because it's so complicated and hard, it slows us down and we tend to see those extra words and those significant details that can really make a sermon sing and help your people understand. And the third detail about man in the chapter, of course, is that man alone bears the image of God. Then God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and so forth and so on. Now, theologians debate precisely what image of God means. The words are used in the ancient Near East to describe the images that kings set up for themselves, like Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, setting up an image that didn't have clay feet. It was gold from top to bottom. And it represented him, his kingdom, and his authority. We saw Saddam Hussein do the same thing in Iraq. He put up images of himself that were more than just a picture. They represent his authority. And so when we liberated that country at first, the people pulled those statues down and beat them with their shoes, you remember, as a sign of disrespect, not to the statue, but to the man whose image it conveyed. And God has put mobile images of himself all across this world as a sign, this is my world, my kingdom, where my authority is to be obeyed. And so when man sinned, he was doubly disobedient. He didn't just disobey God, he disobeyed the very purpose of his creation. So we alone as human beings share the communicable attributes of God, right? And there's 5 R's. We are rational. We're created to think God's thoughts after him, right? Fish don't do philosophy, but we do. We think. We are also relational. We're capable of I-thou relationships in a way far beyond the herd instinct of other animals. Animals herd together and they mate and so forth, but there's a depth and a profundity to our relationships that pattern God's relationship with his Son and with his people. The father-son relationship, God with himself, and the husband-wife relationship, God with his people. And we're designed to pattern that. We're also regal. We're designed with authority, delegated authority to rule the cosmos for its good and for God's glory. We're righteous. We have a conscience, as C.S. Lewis, I think, or was it Chesterton said, I think it was Lewis, that man alone has a conscience and we blush and know that we ought to. Right? I think my dog might have a conscience, though I'm not sure. When he sits in my chair in the bedroom and I walk in, his ears kind of do the Wile E. Coyote thing, and he knows I'm unhappy with him. But so relational, rational, regal, righteous, and religious. God is God-centered, and he made us to be God-centered beings as well, to be focused on him. And he hardwires the liturgy of worship into the created week, which ends in worship in the Old Testament and begins with worship in the New and the Lord's Day. Now, this unique dignity, when do we become image of God? And that was a matter of theological debate. Augustine wasn't sure. Some of the Puritans weren't sure and made some infelicitous statements in that regard. But if they'd read their Bibles clearly, we would know that man at the very moment of his creation in the womb becomes the image of God. Psalm 139, for you formed my inward parts. You wove me together in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were written all of the days that were ordained for me, while as yet there was not one of them. And the abortionist in Planned Parenthood, which if ever there was a gaslighting name in all the world, that's it. It's not Planned Murder, it's Planned Parenthood, it's Planned Murder. The abortionist gets his pen and says, none of that matters. The mother says, none of that matters. All of the days that God had ordained for that child, I'm going to wipe out. Now, we know God permitted that. His decree wasn't surprised and so forth and so on. But the potential of a life decreed by God is wiped out by the fate of these confused human beings, some of whom are doctors. And they know what they're doing, the doctors do at least. David's language in Psalm 51 is even more intimate. 51 verse 5. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. Now, the language is very intimate. The Hebrew is, in sin my mother was hot for me, literally he says. David's describing graphically the aftermath of a passionate night of lovemaking in Jesse's household. Mrs. Jesse is calming down, her sweat is drying, her heart is slowing, her breathing is settling, and deep inside her womb, two cells are becoming one. In sin, my mother conceived me. And David is not describing the act of conception as if sex was sinful. He's describing the product of conception. In sin, my mother conceived me. It wasn't a ball of cells that she conceived. It was me, David the king. David the type of Christ. David the shepherd boy, the giant killer. I was conceived in her womb at that moment when two cells became one. And the words that the Holy Spirit inspired David to use are very significant too. He could have used the word transgression. That would have been inaccurate. The word transgression in Hebrew describes a deliberate presumptive act of disobedience. Well, a clump of cells can't do that. But the word iniquity and sin are very descriptive. Sin means something imperfect, something that falls short of the standard that God establishes. That at the very beginning, David says, there was a principle of imperfection in the core of my being. And iniquity is the word for guilt. It describes the perverseness of a nature that tends to arc away from God like an arrow fired from a crooked bow. And it's interesting that David uses those two words to describe himself at the earliest moment of his existence. That is significant. And so when you think of all that, men, we must steady ourselves and hold the line in the midst of our culture of death. The Muslims sometimes say, we love death more than you love life. I'm not sure that's true, actually, in America today. There's an awful lot of the love of death in our culture and in our hospitals. And we have to remind our people from the pulpit that human beings at every stage of their existence, from cradle to grave, bear the image of God and demand our protection. So, let's jump into the ethical issues. It took a little longer than I was expecting, but that's okay. It's always better to spend more time in the Bible. So, the beginning of life. Let's begin with abortion quickly. I'll skip over that paragraph. Abortion. As pastors, we must never tire in reminding our congregation that abortion is sinful and is always wrong in terms of abortion, right? Even in cases where pregnancy results from rape or incests, while these acts violate the agency and the dignity and the humanity of the mother, yet when life is conceived through them, that life has been authored by God, bears his image, and must be protected. To make it clear to you, right? I hope maybe some of you are wobbly on that issue here. If you can kill the child in the womb because it's the product of incest or rape, right? Because it would hurt the mother and grieve the mother every day to watch this child. Well, if you can kill him in the womb, you can kill him when he's 5 years old. Let's get Tommy. He's 5 years old. He was raped. His mother was raped and he was born. And she just is a burden looking after this boy. Would any of you recommend us just taking Johnny outside the back of the house, putting a Glock 19 to his head and pulling the trigger? Of course not. Well, if you can't do it in the backyard when he's 5 years of age, you can't do it in the womb when he's 5 seconds old either, because he bears the image of God. He'll not feel the pain then, but he bears the image of God then, and he must be protected. What about exceptions? When the mother's life is at risk, and I mean at risk, right? Probably the clearest example of that is an ectopic or tubular pregnancy. The egg has been fertilized, or the ovum has been fertilized, and rather than nestling in the womb, it nestles in one of the two fallopian tubes. And it's stuck there. and you can't transplant it from the tube to the womb, and that tube cannot expand, doesn't have myometrium, the muscle of the womb, to expand. And so as that baby grows, within about 6, 7, 8 weeks, that tube will burst and the mother's life will be in immediate jeopardy. And I believe it is lawful to remove that pregnancy, not to kill the child. Your purpose is to save the life of the mother. I don't believe that is murder. It is defending the life of the mother. A more complicated situation would be breast cancer during pregnancy. Breast cancer is normally fed by hormones. Hormones are ablaze during pregnancy. Mothers get breast cancer when she's pregnant. That breast cancer is going to grow more aggressively and spread more rapidly during a pregnancy. What to do, right? It's not as clear-cut then. Most women I have counseled and have witnessed as Christians going through this, they tend to remain pregnant as long as they can until the child becomes viable. The best chance of survival for the child is after about 25, 26, 27, 28 weeks, but in and around that period of time, they then give birth to the child goes to NICU, and mum then goes for aggressive cancer therapy. The problem is if you give cancer therapy when the child is in the womb, most cancer therapy will interrupt cell division, kills rapidly dividing cells, and will either kill the child or leave the child handicapped or profoundly deformed. So it's a tension, it's a tightrope to walk. But most of the women in our church will, I think, choose the first option. But it's a difficult issue and it requires careful thought. And there's no, you have to kind of think this through and work it out with your flock. Okay, moving on. Genetic editing and screening, okay. So CRISPR, the technology CRISPR, combined regularly interspaced palindromic repeats, which probably means marginally less to you than it does to me, but it's a new technology for editing DNA, right? So imagine your body's like a fortress and viruses are like an invading army. Within this fortress, there's a team of guards equipped with a special weapon that not only fights off the invaders, but also remembers them for future attacks, right? That's the CRISPR system. When a virus attacks, your cell captures a small piece of the virus's genetic material. It slices it and stores it in its DNA, like taking a photograph of the invader. This storage site is called a CRISPR array. It's a mugshot gallery of past invaders. And your cells make RNA copy of these mugshots and they distribute them through your body. They act like wanted posters, helping your cells recognize a virus if it comes knocking again. And the RNA in your cells teams up with a special protein called Cas, C-A-S, which acts a bit like a security guard. So if the virus comes and attacks you again, the RNA wanted boosters guide the Cas proteins to the invader's genetic material, and the Cas proteins cut up the virus's DNA, thereby stopping it replicating and killing you. It's marvelous, right? And it all came from an explosion. It's an amazing thing. So the ethical implications. So this CRISPR technology borrows from this natural defense mechanism and allows scientists to slice up DNA wherever they want. They can put the cut wherever they want in the DNA. That has potential for curing some genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis, for example. For it also can improve crops, and there's a host of other advances there as well. But it raises important ethical questions, like, should we play God? Do we have the right to edit and design babies to our own whim? Because this is not just going to be used, of course, to remove the cystic fibrosis gene or something like that, or an Alzheimer's risk gene. But it's going to be used for eye color and size, weight, athletic ability, and all those things. You're opening Pandora's box in a can of worms, and it requires careful theological thought. Isaiah says in chapter 45, verse 9, "Woe to him who strives with him who formed him, a pot among earthen pots. Does the clay say to him who forms it, 'What are you making? And why is your work no handles?'" There are also safety concerns, like unwanted consequences. We bring in kudzu because we think it'll stop soil erosion, and look what happened. Fire ants the same. Then we brought them in from Mexico. They'll be good. They'll kill bugs in the cotton farms, and look what happened. And so, I mean, these are the people who run the DMV and the IRS, right? And you want to give them charge and authority to cut up DNA. Oh yeah, we could just be a cut here and a cut there, and the angels are going, these are idiots. Like, they're like mental patient with a hammer walking about trying to edit an F-22 Raptor, right? Your hammer is not going to make that plane much better, and it might actually make it a lot worse. Just saying. So CRISPR, no more time. Prenatal and perinatal care. What about prenatal screening and diagnosis? So prenatal tests can detect conditions like Down syndrome and spina bifida and other genetic disorders. Most of those tests now are non-invasive. Back in my day, they had to do amniocentesis that brought about a 1% chance of a miscarriage, and it wasn't worth the risk. It can be helpful to know if your child has got Down syndrome or some other problem. You can prepare, you can line up potential surgery on its heart and other things early after birth. It can be a benefit, but it can also allow doctors to put considerable pressure on women to have an abortion. And those tests are not always, they're getting better, but they're not always 100% right. Some of the signs of Down syndrome are very soft, looking at the ultrasound, the thickness of a child's neck and so forth. And there's been many a child that the parents were encouraged to abort, and actually the child was born and was completely normal. And even if it's an abnormality that's not inconsistent, what's the word? Non-compatible with life, like anencephaly, where the top of the child's head is missing. It's called the curse of the Celts, common back in Ireland. The people with no brains. But it really is common. It's common back in Ireland. It's common as is cystic fibrosis. But I digress. The child will not live more than a couple of days outside the womb, but it's still days that God has given that child, and what right do we have to kill that child and to rob it of its life? That's important. We are, as Christians, to defend the weak and the fatherless, and there's no one weaker than the child in the womb. So that's prenatal screening. In vitro fertilization has brought joy to many Christians struggling with infertility. But it also raises significant ethical questions, right? So IVF, it involves fertilizing eggs with sperm outside the body in a lab. And once fertilized, the embryos are either implanted in the uterus or frozen for future use. Now, ethical considerations, number of embryos you fertilize. Not every embryo you try to fertilize will fertilize or be viable once it is, and so the doctors tend to fertilize a lot more embryos than they need. And then when they implant the embryos in the womb, it's an expensive process. Not every embryo that you implant will be fertile, that you put in the womb will implant in the womb. Even under normal circumstances, about a fifth of all pregnancies actually abort in the first trimester. I mean, abort naturally, just because they have some problem and it's a heavy period. Many women are pregnant and never even knew it, and it was just God's providence the child was taking. So even in normal situations, many fertilized ovum don't implant, and when surgeons are poking around with needles and so forth, and it makes it much more complicated. So they tend to try and put in more ovum than they need. And that number's decreasing. It used to be a lot more than 4 or 5, and now it's down to, I think, 3, depending on the age of the mother. But still, if all those ovums implant, doctors will often recommend a selective reduction, because a triplet pregnancy is much higher risk to the mother and the children than a single pregnancy. And so they'll recommend selective reduction, which is, of course, abortion. And so that's an ethical consideration. And then you're left at the end of the process, often with a host of these snowflake embryos that are human beings, that are fertilized, that are frozen in some petri dish or in some test tube somewhere. And that's a problem as well. What do you do with these human beings? Do you leave them frozen? Not much of a life. Do you go for a football team-sized family? Or do you offer these children up for adoption and a surrogate pregnancy, which I think is a better option for those who are unable to support more children in their own family. But that brings theological concerns as well. What kind of family are these children going to go to? If you're Presbyterian, some of us are, we believe those children are covenant children, and can you ensure they'll go to a Christian home? And even if you're not Presbyterian, you certainly want your unfertilized ovum to be raised by Christians. And so those are, and I think there are some adoption agencies that focus on getting embryos from Christian parents into homes with Christian parents. Those are all issues. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis also has the same kind. Doing a gene test on the baby has the same ethical problems, right? With the same ethical problems with prenatal screening. You get information. Do you want the information? What are you going to do with it when you get it? That's something to think about. But even thinking about that for a second, just let me riff a second here. When it comes to the CRISPR technology, right? Let's say you were a vet in Iraq and you had your leg blown off or more body parts blown off in an IED explosion, and they can put the DNA of a lizard into your cells, and lizards can regrow their legs, and they can splice that DNA in and give you legs back again. Would you want that? Interesting. It'd be really good to have legs again. So the problem is, of course, with that is you have to figure out, when you start monkeying with the physics and monkeying with DNA, at a certain point, when do you cease to be a human being? I mean, you can't make a hybrid you can't just add, and this is irreducibly complicated. You're taking a crocodile or a gecko's DNA and putting it into you. I wonder what size your leg would be, but that DNA has other functions too, and so it just opens up a whole can of worms with human beings trying to pretend that they are God. Something I didn't have in my notes, what about stem cells? So stem cells, up until fairly recently, stem cells, right, stop. Back together. So stem cells, when a baby's made in the womb and two cells become one, you get one cell which becomes two cells, then 4, then 8, then 16, 32, and so forth. And it's called a blastocyst. And a blastocyst is a ball of cells tumbling down the fallopian tube and implants in the womb. At that stage, those cells are not specialized. They can be anything that they want to be. Right? All of your cells in your body have the ability, have the knowledge to be any cell they want to be. But once they become a skin cell or a muscle cell or a fat cell or a nerve cell, they're stuck. They're going to be that way forever, right? Well, in the womb, in the blastocyst, these cells tumbling down the womb, they are still plastic. They can be whatever they want to be. At a certain stage, very early on, like within the first week or so, maybe even the first few days, some of the cells go, we're going to be the head. And the other ones go, we're going to be the tail. And we're going to be the middle and everything in between. And it kind of then the magic starts happening. Well, up until recently, if you wanted to get, if you could take these cells, that could be anything they wanted to be, and you could take those cells and make them into a cartilage cell, for example, it could fix arthritis in your knee or your hip, or give you pancreatic cells if you were diabetic. Interesting. Up until fairly recently, the only way to get those cells was to harvest aborted fetuses. So that's clearly wrong. A lot of those cells that were taken from a baby that was aborted in 1973, and I don't have the precise details of that, but it was a dead fetus. So does it become sinful? Is there an ethical distinction between taking it'd be like a Chinese person is executed and the Chinese government harvests his organs, and they kill him to harvest his organs. And your wife is dying of kidney failure, and this kidney could match her. Would it be wrong for you to use his kidney? Well, he's dead anyway, right? And it's your wife, right? The death was sinful and the kidney's going to be wasted. Would it be wrong for you to use it? Probably, because it would only encourage the Chinese to do that more and more and more. But there's an ethical difference between killing a child to harvest its its cells, and a child that's already been killed but was frozen and taking its cells and using them. There's a slight ethical difference there. Not a lot, but a slight one. It's a concern. Having said that, they now have the ability to take a cell from you and fiddle with it and make it a pluripotent blast cell, and it can then become a brain cell for you, or a kidney cell, or a pancreatic cell. That does have some promise. It's still very early on, but it comes from you, therefore you can't reject it, and it could really help in the years to come, and I don't have an ethical problem with that nearly as much as some of the other technology we talked about earlier in the day. End of life perspective, there's a lot more I had to say, and I'm going to just cut to the chase, 4 minutes left. So, end of life. The biggest end of life challenge you will face is palliative care, probably, right? Someone is dying of cancer or Alzheimer's disease, and they're clearly in pain, and the doctors are wanting to give the patient morphine or so forth and so on. When you give morphine, it takes away the pain, but it also takes away your desire to breathe, which will then cause the base of your lungs to collapse. You won't breathe as deeply or as often. The base of your lungs will collapse, and that collapsed lung will get infection, they'll get pneumonia, and they'll die faster than they would have done anyway. Is that sinful? I would argue no, because the doctor's desire is not to give them 10 milligrams of fentanyl and kill them. The doctor is trying to alleviate their pain, make them comfortable. There is a time to die, and I don't believe it's our calling as physicians or pastors to ensure that people live as long as they can. There are years in our life, and there's life in our years, and when our time to come goes, it's not wrong for doctors to keep us comfortable. But assisted suicide is a very different matter. And you can expect that to be coming to a medical center near you. The whole thesis behind the book No Country for Old Men, which became a movie, was if you can, because you remember the killer in the movie killed people with cattle prods, cattle, whatever those things are, and he was killing them like animals. That's all they were to him, right? And there's a bit in the book where the Tommy Lee Jones character is lamenting this to his granddaughter, or his granddaughter's talking about this, and he says, well, and someone says to, I haven't read the book, but I'm quoting, I think, an Alan Moore article I read years ago, but someone comments, well, if they can kill them, if the baby isn't safe in the womb, you'll not be safe when you get to the old age pensioner home with Alzheimer's, when they put you to sleep like a well-loved dog. And that's a real problem. Not just taking life, but people feeling pressurized. Medical bills are expensive. Dad, you've got cancer, you've got Alzheimer's disease. Dad, you're going to be, you're going to forget about it anyway. It's going to be very, very expensive. We can't afford $6,000 a month or $10,000 a month putting you in the home for the bewildered. Let's just take you to your bedroom. You can listen to some Beethoven or AC/DC, whatever floats your boat, and we'll give you a wee shot in the arm, and you'll be asleep, and you'll not know anything about it. And people are going to feel that pressure, and they already are. There are insurance companies that are refusing to pay for people's chemotherapy or advanced chemotherapy, but they're offering them the end-of-life pill. And so you're facing this pressure and challenge, and we're going to need great courage and resolve as pastors. Similar to that, do not resusc orders. If somebody's dying of cancer, doctors do not need to rob that person of dignity by going to heroic efforts to, if the person wants that, that's fine. But if you're dying and you're multi-organ failure, it is wise and sensible, I believe, to let Providence take its course. And so I don't think DNR orders are sinful either. That was a bit of a shotgun approach, but I didn't have time for the second half of the lecture. I apologize. So in conclusion, the end-of-life decisions we face are profound and complex. As pastors, we must provide guidance that upholds the sanctity of life, reflects the compassion of Christ, and respects also the right and dignity of each individual to, under the remit of God's word and God's law, to decide what kind of medical care they go under. Like someone with pancreatic cancer, for example, And is there an ethical imperative for them to go through vicious chemotherapy to add 3 months to their life or 6 months to their life? Not necessarily. You can, as a human being, you can decide, how heroically do I fight? If my daughter's getting married in 4 months, I might be willing to fight pretty hard. But if I'm 83 and I've had a good life and my grandchildren are up and I've seen them and so forth and so on, I may well be more inclined to let nature and providence take their course and usher me home to God. Thank you for having me, men. It's a great privilege to be here today, and thankful for your time.